So all over social media and the mainstream media, there has been talks about how great the Iron Dome is and how accurate it is.
The IDF claim it is at 95% success rate.
It probably is 95%. Because they're just shooting up expensive ass firecrackers.
Why do we only see the chemtrails coming from the Iron Dome missiles, but not the Hamas missiles?
Why aren't these media photographers not afraid? And if the Iron Dome missiles are coming towards them, does that mean they are on Gaza's land?
This is how a successful Hamas missile attack looks like.
Now, why don't we see an explosion of this magnitude when they are exploding in the air?
Does the Iron Dome disarm the Hamas warhead in the air?
Nope.
I understand these missiles are actually destroying physical matter, but we should see a fraction of the destruction. And the other Hamas chemtrails.
But we only see missiles coming from one direction.
Now there's been an MIT professor that is an expert on missiles that has proved the Iron Dome is at best 5% accurate. But that white paper has been scrubbed off the internet.
They say this Hamas surprise attack was Israel's 9/11, and there is some truth to that as these buildings are being controlled demolished from the bottom.
We should see some signs of impact coming from the roof, but we don't.
How does the explosion occur? Before this supposed missile even strikes the building.
Jedan take missile expetunou missiles don't work like that.
I'll post the full band off the internet interview in its entirety on Rumble and YouTube.
I will cut to the good stuff now. But you should check out the full video. It's pretty interesting. You will know why this video is scrubbed off the internet when they abruptly just ended the show and rolled out the credits during the interview.
Rocket warhead.
So how often have these rockets been intercepted?
Well, we don't know exactly, but my guess is maybe 5% of the time. It may not even be that. Maybe 5% of the time. It may not even be that. Maybe 5% of the time. It may not even be that good.
95% of the time they miss?
It looks that way, yes.
I mean, if you're watching television in the United States, as we just played those clips, it's universally accepted that it is the reason for the low casualty rate for Israelis.
Well, let me remind you that in the Gulf War of 1991, the intercept rate of the Patriot missile defense over Israel and Saudi Arabia was reported as 96%, even higher. And we analyzed the information we obtained from television videos. And when we were finished, the general view among all informed technical people was that the intercept rate of Patriot was probably zero. The general view among all informed technical people was that the intercept rate of Patriot was probably zero. So people look at these explosions in the sky, they associate this light show with successful intercepts, and what they are seeing are the explosion of the Iron Dome warheads.
U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel sent a letter to Congress requesting $225 million more in U.S. funding to accelerate production of the Dome missile defense components. What is the company that benefits from this, or the military contractors that are getting this money?
Well, the company that will benefit, the American company that will benefit most, there will be companies in Israel that also benefit, is the Raytheon Corporation, which is out here in Massachusetts.
So that's where the money goes?
Well, a large part of it will go. I haven't been able to find any information on how much will be paid to Raytheon for each interceptor that's built.
Do you think the money is well spent, Professor Postal?
I would not spend money on an interceptor that has near zero chance of intercepting an artillery rocket. The interceptor probably costs well in excess of $100,000 per interceptor, and it's maybe achieving a 5% rate, maybe, could be lower, against rockets that maybe cost $1,000 each or $500 each. So the cost exchange ratio is fine if you're Israeli and the dollars are not coming out of your pocket. But in the case of an American system, I would certainly not support such a system.
How can there be such a disparity between what you claim and everyone else? I mean, the Israeli government says 85 to 90% success rate. Is it lying?
Well, I think there's been quite a lot of sleight of hand on the part of the Israeli government. Now, in all fairness, there are reasons, that could be justified in warfare for lying. First of all, you could lie because it calms your population to think that they're being defended. Now, there is a double-edged sword here, though, because if people think they are being defended, they may not take shelter. And in November of 2012, 3 people were killed.
We have 10 seconds.
3 people were killed on a porch because they were out looking at Iron Dome supposedly successfully intercepting.
We're going to continue this conversation after the show, and then we'll post it at democracynow.org. Professor Theodore Postal of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, thanks so much for joining us. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman. democracynow.org is our Israel's Iron Dome interceptor has shot down some 90% of Palestinian rockets it engaged during this week's surge of Gaza fighting, up from 85% rate in the previous mini-war of 2012. Professor Postal, your response.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to say that the press needs to engage in more due diligence on these matters. Where does this number come from? The number comes from an Israeli spokesperson. Now, if I give a number, and incidentally, I have a long record of being correct on these matters, you don't hear the press coming to me and asking me, do I believe that number is correct? And if I don't believe the number is correct, why would I not believe the number is correct? This is really, you can really put this back on the due diligence of the press with regard to this matter. They're just accepting information from an interested party.
This is the part 2 of the interview.
On Monday, President Obama signed a bill granting an additional $225 million in emergency funding for Israel to replenish its arsenal of interceptor missiles for its Iron Dome defense system. The emergency spending was approved unanimously by the Senate and by a 395-8 vote in the House. Well, amidst universal support from politicians and the corporate media, one of the nation's leading missile experts says there is now no evidence Iron Dome is actually working. Theodore Postal is well known within defense circles for exposing the failures of the Patriot missile system during Operation Desert Storm in 1991.
We turn now to part 2 of our conversation with the MIT professor. Theodore Postal joined us on the show last week from Boston. He's a professor of science, technology, and national security at MIT. He recently wrote an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists headlined, "The Evidence That Shows Iron Dome is Not Working." I began by asking Professor Postal if he could compare the previous Israeli assault on Gaza, when there wasn't any Iron Dome, to what's happening now.
These comparisons are a little tricky because the defense system that's saving so many saving lives in Israel is the early warning and sheltering system. And the early warning system has been improved through the use of telephones. So, for example, if you're in a city somewhere where the Israeli radar is determined that an artillery rocket is heading in your direction, you will get an audible signal that says you need to take shelter. And then there's a shelter system that's been built in advance all over these areas of Israel. Plus, you would have a shelter in your home if you were actually in your home. So all you would need is 10 seconds of warning or less to get in a shelter in your home. And you could actually get to shelters very quickly on the outside, because these shelters are all over the place where the population is dense, and the Israeli government has predicted there will be a likely attack.
Let me quote from Reuters, July 10th. Israel's Iron Dome interceptor has shot down some 90% of Palestinian rockets it engaged during this week's surge of Gaza fighting, up from 85% rate in the previous mini-war of 2012. Professor Postal, your response.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to say that the press needs to engage in more due diligence on these matters. Where does this number come from? The number comes from an Israeli spokesperson. Now, if I give a number, and incidentally, I have a long record of being correct on these matters, you don't hear the press coming to me and asking me, do I believe that number is correct? And if I don't believe the number is correct, why would I not believe the number is correct? This is really, you can really put this back on the due diligence of the press with regard to this matter. They're just accepting information from an interested party.
So can you explain further how this works? How the Iron Dome, how Raytheon built this?
Well, the Iron Dome was is mostly an Israeli development, although Raytheon is involved. The Iron Dome interceptor has to approach an incoming artillery rocket head-on. So if you saw an Iron Dome interceptor flying a near vertical trajectory, that would indicate the Iron Dome interceptor is in a near head-on engagement geometry coming at the artillery rocket. In that geometry, the interceptor has some chance of destroying the artillery rocket warhead. If you see the Iron Dome interceptor engaging the artillery rocket from the side or from the back by chasing it, then it has essentially a zero chance of destroying the artillery rocket warhead. So if you look up in the sky and you look at the hundreds of videos we now have of the contrails, of the smoke trails of the Iron Dome interceptors, you can see that almost all the time, there are exceptions, but almost all the time, the Iron Dome interceptors are traveling parallel to the ground, which means that the falling artillery rocket is engaged from the side, or the Iron Dome interceptors are diving to the ground, which means that they are trying to chase artillery rockets from behind. All those engagements are zero probability of intercept. And we're guessing, based on what we have, that maybe 10% or 15 or 20% of the engagements are head-on. Actually, it's not 20%, it's closer to 10%. And when you see so few engagements head-on, your conclusion is that the system is not working the vast majority of the time.
This goes to the issue of the proportionality of the attack on Gaza. And so often when this issue is raised, and I think it's 3 Israeli civilians, and of course every death is horrific on either side, but when this issue is raised, Israel just says, well, we have an extremely effective Iron Dome system. If it's not Iron Dome, is it simply saying that these rockets that Hamas and other groups are firing off are just they're not working? I mean, if their intention is to kill, that they are not lethal weapons. If so few people have died and Iron Dome isn't working.
Well, one has to realize, one has to know some simple technical facts. First of all, most artillery rockets are carrying warheads in the 10 to 20-pound range. So if you're sitting in a room and the rocket comes through the roof and explodes in the room, it will kill you, and it will kill everybody else in the room. If you have 10 seconds or 20 seconds of warning, and you go into the shelter that's by law built in your home, and the rocket happens to hit your home, you won't be killed. It can even hit the shelter, and you won't be killed. So sheltering and early warning are extremely critical to keeping the death toll down. Now, the odds of an artillery rocket going through the roof and into your room are very low. They're high enough that if I were in Israel, I would advise you, and I would do so myself, I would take shelter, because there's, the inconvenience is small relative to being killed or injured. But most of these rockets are landing in open areas, landing between buildings, landing outside buildings, and the real danger is that this relatively low lethality warhead lands within 10 or 20 feet of you. Now, if you just lie on the ground, let's say you're caught in the open and you can't go to a shelter, the Israeli government itself will tell you that your chances of being a casualty from a falling artillery rocket are reduced by 80%, 80%, if you simply lie on the ground. Now, the reason for that is the lethal range of these these low-weight warheads is not very large, and they are blowing fragments out, sort of like a shotgun. And if you get close to the ground, unless you're very unlucky and the thing lands on you or lands very close to you, you're not going to be injured by the explosion. So although these artillery rockets are fantastically disruptive with regard to the functioning of Israeli society, and I think that that is true, and because of that, there's a psychological and political leverage associated with these artillery rocket attacks. They are not killing people, as long as people are taking shelter and sheltering is available.
Professor Postel, I'm looking at a Boston Globe piece on the Iron Dome and Raytheon being a key in the Israeli defense plan. And it says, for Raytheon, the Israeli contracts, part of a co-production deal with Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, present a potential financial windfall. Much of the work would be done at Raytheon's Tucson, Arizona missile systems plant, as well as by subcontractors across the country. Can you talk more about exactly what Raytheon does, and if this Iron Dome system is now being sold to other countries?
Well, I'm not aware of sales to other countries at this point. I haven't been following that part of the issue. On the question of foreign aid, in this case to Israel, it's very common. It's almost always the United States government requires that foreign aid largely be spent with using American companies. And in the case of Raytheon, they are the premier company for basically building missiles and interceptors of all kinds. So it's a natural business arrangement for Raytheon to be a big beneficiary of an agreement like that, because the money goes to Israel in a virtual way, but it basically is spent in the United States. Now, this raises the question of the cost of these interceptors. The Israelis are saying, at least some Israelis are saying, that the interceptors cost $20,000 each. Now, the reason for lowballing this number, I'll give you a sense of what it could cost, is because the interceptors, the Iron Dome interceptors, are intercepting rockets that might cost $500 or $1,000 each. So there's an issue of how much you should pay, assuming the system is working, for stopping an artillery rocket, especially if the passive defense, if the taking shelter, saves lives. And for example, if how many artillery shells cause $20,000 or $100,000 worth of damage, and the actual cost of an Iron Dome interceptor is almost certainly well over $100,000, not the $20,000 that some Israeli sources seem to be saying. Now, just to give you a sense of how off the cost could be, again, we don't know at this point. Another interesting fact is so much we don't know, yet people are throwing money at this. There's a comparable missile in its cost called the Sidewinder. It's an air-to-air missile that Raytheon manufactures and sells. the Iron Dome interceptor is very close to an air-to-air missile. It's a very small missile, weighs about 200 pounds. And so does this air-to-air missile. Different design, though. That costs $400,000 each. So how is it possible to build an interceptor that has the same advanced technologies, not exactly the same, but similar, and roughly the same size, and it only costs $20,000 each? There's a significant question there about whether the Congress and the American people have accurate information about what the system is really costing.
So you're raising very serious questions about the effectiveness of Iron Dome. Hundreds of millions of dollars, in fact, more than the Obama administration has asked for, is being discussed in Congress to pour into this, mainly to Raytheon and other U.S. companies. Have you been called by anyone in Congress to testify, to raise your concerns?
Of course not. Congress is not interested in information. What I can tell you, I have not been directly involved, but I have been privy to discussions with members of Congress who have oversight responsibilities, who have acknowledged in those discussions that they have no idea whether Iron Dome is working or not. And I can also tell you that the U.S. government has not been given any information on the performance of Iron Dome. So when Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, makes a statement about how well Iron Dome is working, somebody should ask Susan Rice, what's her source? Because I can tell you that and she should have a source. She should be able to tell you, we had the following national laboratory take the data from the Israelis, they looked at it, and let me tell you, this thing is working well. Instead, she gets on television and talks about this working well. Somebody should ask her. Somebody in the press corps should do their due diligence and ask her, where did you get this information?
Well, I mean, it's not just Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor. It's President Obama himself. This is what President Obama said.
There's no country on earth that can be expected to live under a daily barrage of rockets. And I'm proud that the Iron Dome system that Americans helped Israel develop and fund has saved many Israeli lives.
That's President Obama.
Mr. Obama should be able to answer the question of which American technical institution has obtained the data from the Israelis and verified the accuracy of the data and verified that the performance levels are what they are. I know that the Israelis have the data. They have radar data. They have video data in the visible. They have video data in the infrared. They have substantial amounts of data that they could and should make available to the United States, to our technical institutions, and have this data reviewed and certified. And any politician, whether it's the president or his national security advisor, who makes a claim that this system is performing that well, should be able to point a finger at the specific agency that has the technical resources to review this data and has obtained this data from the Israelis. This is just an outrage.
Physicist Theodore Postel. He's a professor of science, technology, and national security policy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He recently wrote an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist called "The Evidence That Shows Iron Dome is Not Working." This is Democracy Now! To see the first part of that interview, you can go to democracynow.org.